The American Civil War was a defining event in the history of the United States, lasting from April 12, 1861, to April 9, 1865. It was fought primarily between the Union, which represented the northern states, and the Confederacy, composed of 11 southern states that seceded from the Union. The war was driven by a variety of social, economic, and political factors, the most significant being the issue of slavery. Below is a comprehensive exploration of the causes, major battles, important figures, and lasting effects of the Civil War. Causes of the Civil War. Slavery. The most significant cause of the Civil War was the issue of slavery. By the mid-19th century, the northern states had largely abolished slavery, while the southern states depended heavily on enslaved African Americans to work on plantations. The southern economy was largely agrarian, with cotton, tobacco, and rice being the primary crops. These crops were labor-intensive, and the plantation owners relied on enslaved people to provide the necessary labor force. The North, on the other hand, had shifted toward industrialization and a more diversified economy. Many in the North, particularly abolitionists, viewed slavery as morally wrong and an impediment to progress. The South, however, defended slavery as essential to its economic system and way of life. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new territories should allow slavery became a source of increasing tension. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 were attempts to resolve these disputes by drawing lines between free and slave states. However, these measures were temporary solutions to a deeply rooted issue. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers in new territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, further inflamed tensions and led to violent conflict in Kansas. States' rights. The debate over states' rights was another key cause of the Civil War. Many in the South believed that individual states had the right to make decisions for themselves, including whether or not to permit slavery. This belief in states' rights was rooted in the Constitution, which, according to some interpretations, limited the powers of the federal government. Southern leaders argued that states should have the authority to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional and that they had the right to secede from the Union if they felt their rights were being violated. The North, by contrast, held that the federal government had ultimate authority over the states and that the Union must be preserved at all costs. Economic differences. In addition to slavery and states' rights, economic differences between the North and South contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. The North had developed a more industrialized economy, with factories, railroads, and a growing middle class. The South, by contrast, remained largely agricultural, with its economy centered around large plantations and cash crops such as cotton and tobacco. These economic differences created distinct cultures and political interests in the two regions. The North supported tariffs and other measures to protect American industries from foreign competition, while the South opposed these policies, which they saw as benefiting Northern businesses at the expense of Southern agriculture. The election of Abraham Lincoln. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the immediate trigger for the Civil War. Lincoln, the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Although he did not initially call for the abolition of slavery in states where it already existed, many in the South viewed his election as a direct threat to their way of life. Following Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union on December 20, 1860. Over the next few months, 10 other Southern states followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. Major battles and campaigns of the Civil War. Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Union garrison, led by Major Robert Anderson, was forced to surrender after 34 hours of bombardment. This attack marked the start of hostilities, and Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This action led to the secession of 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The First Battle of Bull Run, July 21, 1861. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, was the first major land battle of the Civil War. It took place on July 21, 1861, near Manassas, Virginia. Union forces, under the command of General Irvin McDowell, were initially successful but were eventually driven back by Confederate troops led by General P.G.T. Beauregard and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The Union Army retreated in disorder, and the battle made clear that the war would be longer and more brutal than many had anticipated. The Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, was the bloodiest single day in American military history. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the day. Although the battle was technically a draw, it halted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. The Union, led by General George McClellan, failed to pursue Lee's army, but the battle gave Lincoln the opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States would be free as of January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation. Issued by Lincoln on January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the Civil War. Although it did not immediately free any enslaved people, as it applied only to the Confederate States, it transformed the war into a struggle for human freedom. The proclamation also discouraged foreign powers such as Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, as they were unlikely to support a government that defended slavery. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 to July 3, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, in Pennsylvania, was one of the most significant battles of the Civil War. General Lee's Confederate forces clashed with Union troops under General George Meade in a three-day battle that ended in a decisive Union victory. The battle resulted in approximately 51,000 casualties, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg ended his invasion of the North and marked a turning point in the war. The Siege of Vicksburg, May 18 to July 4, 1863. At the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant were engaged in a siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a key Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. After a 6-week siege, the Confederate garrison surrendered on July 4, 1863. The Union victory at Vicksburg gave the North control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in two. Grant's success in the West earned him national fame and led to his promotion as the commander of all Union armies. Sherman's March to the Sea, November 15 to December 21, 1864. In the latter stages of the war, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman led a devastating campaign through the South, known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Beginning in Atlanta on November 15, 1864, Sherman and his army marched to Savannah, Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and farms along the way. The purpose of this scorched earth strategy was to break the South's ability to wage war and undermine civilian morale. Sherman's campaign was highly effective, and Savannah fell to Union forces on December 21, 1864. Key figures of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln. As the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln led the Union through the Civil War and played a central role in shaping the conflict's outcome. Lincoln was deeply committed to preserving the Union and believed that secession was illegal. His leadership was marked by his ability to navigate complex political challenges and his evolving stance on slavery. Initially focused on preserving the Union, Lincoln came to see the abolition of slavery as essential to achieving a lasting peace. His Emancipation Proclamation and his address at Gettysburg remain two of his most significant contributions to American history. Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865, just days after the war's end. Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis served as the President of the Confederate States of America from its formation in 1861 until its collapse in 1865. A former senator from Mississippi and U.S. Secretary of War, Davis was a staunch defender of states' rights and slavery. As the leader of the Confederacy, he faced immense challenges, including managing a war effort with limited resources and navigating tensions within his own government. Despite his leadership, Davis was unable to secure foreign recognition for the Confederacy, and his government ultimately fell with the defeat of Confederate forces in the field. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the leading general of the Confederate Army. A brilliant tactician, Lee won several significant victories early in the war, including the Second Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Fredericksburg. However, his decision to invade the North in 1863 resulted in his defeat at Gettysburg, which marked a turning point in the war. Lee continued to lead Confederate forces until his surrender to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Lee's surrender marked the effective end of the Confederacy. After the war, Lee advocated for reconciliation between the North and South and served as president of Washington College, which was later renamed Washington and Lee University in his honor. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was the most successful Union general and played a pivotal role in securing the Union victory. After a series of early successes in the Western Theater, including the capture of Vicksburg in 1863, Grant was promoted to commander of all Union armies in 1864. Grant's military strategy emphasized relentless pressure on Confederate forces, and he worked closely with Lincoln to coordinate the Union war effort. His final campaign against Lee in Virginia led to the surrender at Appomattox. Grant's leadership earned him national fame, and he was later elected the 18th President of the United States. William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman was one of the Union's most effective generals and is best known for his March to the Sea campaign, which brought the war to the Southern heartland. Sherman's philosophy of total war aimed to destroy not just Confederate armies but also the economic and psychological capacity of the South to continue fighting. His campaigns through Georgia and the Carolinas were devastating to the South, and his strategy contributed significantly to the Union's victory. After the war, Sherman became commander of the U.S. Army and played a role in the post-war Reconstruction process. The end of the Civil War. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. The Union, bolstered by superior resources and manpower, had gradually worn down Confederate forces. The fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, on April 3, 1865, was a major blow to the South. Just 6 days later, on April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Although some Confederate forces continued to resist, Lee's surrender effectively ended the Civil War. Consequences of the Civil War. Abolition of slavery. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in 1863, had declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territories to be free, but it was the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 that officially ended slavery throughout the entire country. The end of slavery marked a new era in American history, though the road to racial equality would remain long and difficult. Reconstruction. The period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, was marked by efforts to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. From 1865 to 1877, the federal government implemented policies aimed at reforming Southern society and securing rights for African Americans. The 14th and 15th Amendments, passed during this period, granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men. However, Reconstruction faced significant resistance in the South, and after federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, many of the gains made during this period were rolled back by Jim Crow laws and segregationist policies. Political and economic transformation. The Civil War also brought about significant political and economic changes in the United States. The war established the supremacy of the federal government over the states, resolving the long-standing debate over states' rights. It also led to the expansion of federal power in other areas, including the creation of a national banking system, the establishment of land-grant colleges, and the promotion of infrastructure projects such as the Transcontinental Railroad. The industrial growth that had begun before the war accelerated in the post-war years, transforming the United States into a global economic power. Loss of life and destruction. The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history, with an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers and civilians killed. The war devastated much of the South, leaving cities in ruins and large swaths of land desolate. The economic impact of the war was particularly severe in the South, where the destruction of infrastructure, the loss of enslaved labor, and the devastation of agricultural land caused economic hardship for decades. In the North, the war spurred industrial growth, but the human toll was felt across the country. Legacy of the Civil War. The legacy of the Civil War continues to shape the United States. The war resolved the question of secession and established the permanence of the Union, but it left unresolved many of the issues surrounding race and equality. The Civil War is often seen as the beginning of the long struggle for civil rights in the United States, a struggle that would continue through the civil rights movement of the 20th century and beyond. The war also left a lasting cultural legacy, with countless books, films, and monuments commemorating the conflict and its participants. The American Civil War was a watershed moment in U.S. history. It was fought over profound moral, political, and economic differences, most notably the issue of slavery. The war fundamentally reshaped the nation, leading to the abolition of slavery, the preservation of the Union, and the expansion of federal power. However, the war also left deep scars, particularly in the South, and the challenges of Reconstruction and racial equality would persist for generations. Despite its devastation, the Civil War set the stage for the emergence of the United States as a unified and powerful nation, though the struggle for justice and equality would continue well into the future.